record number of drones over Russia.
We have never before recorded such a huge number of UAVs passing through the Bryansk region, then the Smolensk region heading towards the Tver, Pskov and Leningrad regions.
Residents of the Smolensk region report 5 bright explosions at the Lukoil oil depot, where the storage tank farm has a capacity of over 10,000 cubic meters for storing petroleum products.
Ours is closed, Kostya, but what if something suddenly falls on Lukoil now?
No, not right now.
Yes, right on Lukoil, look.
The mayor of Moscow even reports that 9 drones were shot down near Moscow, which were flying directly toward the capital. And in the Luhansk region, there was an ammunition depot where a powerful detonation continued for a long time. Also in the Leningrad region, it was restless. Drones reached there as well. Because of this, by the way, even the airport in St. Petersburg temporarily suspended operations.
I don't understand. What do you know? I saw everything with my own eyes.
But the residents of the Leningrad region couldn't sleep for a long time since the attacks there lasted until morning.
Damn, I wanted to record a video so many times, but where is this happening? Well, there they are, damn it, those bastards, people.
Of course, the massive Ukrainian attacks on Russia can't be compared to the Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities. But in response to journalists' questions, the president of Ukraine explained why Patriot is not the best option against UAVs.
Today, the United States produces 50 to 60 such missiles per month, being the world's main manufacturer. That's enough missiles for a month, while we are hit by 500 to 800 Shaheds every day. It's clear that Patriot isn't meant for drones anyway. The cost of a single missile is between $2 and $3 million, whereas a drone, whether it's a Shahed or Geran, costs up to $100,000. In other words, you don't fight this with that kind of weapon.
That's why Ukraine has created a multi-layered defense system which exists only in Ukraine and in the occupying country.
Part of the drone, no matter how you look at it, flies low. And these drones can be shot down using fairly inexpensive methods. These are bullets, this is machine gun fire, it's cheap, effective and quite reliable. Secondly, we have interceptor drones. According to various estimates, about 500 Russian drones have already been shot down by our interceptor drones. Plus we have light aircraft. That is, these are small planes with a single engine. And of course, the most important thing is detection.
It turns out that not only Poland has fallen victim to raids by Russian drones, Welt also reports a violation of Lithuanian airspace by 2 drones.
These drones didn't just fly in for no reason. They were being closely monitored from the Russian side as well as from the Belarusian side. When they flew in, the Russians and Belarusians were analyzing the situation. Which radars were activated first and which ones didn't turn on at all. For what reasons? Maybe one was just broken. They scanned the entire radio spectrum. How quickly did they respond? In other words, the Russians were even timing it precisely. Which planes were scrambled for interception? Which airbases? Which pilots? What call signs did they use? And in general, what security systems are in place to protect the most critical and important sites on the territory of the Republic of Poland? So all of this is intelligence gathering.
Nevertheless, NATO is preparing defensive measures in response to the incursion of Russian UAVs into Poland. A political response is also expected. But they are not entirely sure that this will help much.
I know that the Poles came to Ukraine to learn from our experience on how to shoot down these drones. Not to immediately scramble aircraft costing $1.5 million or to use a missile to take down yet another of these plush cardboard drones. Now we will share our experience with the Poles, then they will tell their own people, build their own system, and then, following this example, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and Germany will do exactly the same. I think these are the kinds of measures. And for now what they can do is allocate more money for some radar installations, some sensors.
At a technology exhibition in London, an armored vehicle with a self-propelled mortar was spotted. But interestingly, it displayed the flags of 3 countries and one of them was the flag of Ukraine. But could this mean the possibility of supplying this equipment to Ukrainian defense or not?
Maybe part of this armored vehicle was manufactured in Ukraine possibly, and that's why they painted 3 flags.
Nevertheless, there is information that the Germans have classified the list of their new military aid to Ukraine. It is possible that the supply of equipment is indeed under discussion. but the list itself remains non-public.
The fact is, while the West is deciding how to deliver a new air defense system to Ukraine, Ukraine, in my opinion, is methodically and I think in the only correct way destroying Russia's oil industry. Here's an example for you, in my opinion, simply excellent. The security service of Ukraine struck the largest Russian oil loading port already on the Baltic Sea, a completely different region, which is the final point of the Baltic pipeline system. Roman Sviatan is joining our broadcast, a military expert. We will now discuss with him all these strikes, as well as their effectiveness and prospects. Roman Grigorievich, glad to see you. Hello? The point is that after the drone strikes, fires broke out, oil shipments were suspended, and the estimated daily losses to Russia's budget from the halt in exports could reach up to $41 million. Prymorsk is a key hub for loading the Shadow Fleet, which Russia uses to circumvent international sanctions. As a military expert, hello, greetings. Are such targets something new, in your opinion, in recent months?
We've been talking about this for several months. The best sanctions are the sanctions of Malyuk, Budanov, and now also Madyar. That is, this is the main intelligence directorate, the security service of Ukraine, and the drone forces. And also the special operations forces who are carrying out such missions deep behind enemy lines, the destruction of Russia's oil and gas industry. This is the main objective that we should be focusing on now in order to achieve the larger goal of dismantling the Russian Federation. Why? Because without the collapse of the Russian Empire, without destroying this prison of nations, it will be impossible to completely drive the Russian army out of Ukraine. Yes, it is possible to strike Russian military targets in Crimea because it is practically an operational geographic cauldron ready to be closed off. And there's nowhere for them to go. And in principle, with long-range strike capabilities, this issue can be resolved. Within 6 months, with a sufficient number of drones and missiles, it is basically possible to eliminate the Russian army in Crimea. It is possible to cut off the land corridor in principle by using, for example, at least a couple of aviation brigades to carry out combat missions from the air over a distance of 80 kilometers. Basically, this is a matter of a few months' work again, provided there is a sufficient amount of weaponry. But it won't be possible to push the Russian army out of Donbas as long as the Russian Empire in its current form continues to support this army, because there are 7,000 kilometers of rear area behind Donbas. Therefore, in order to fully liberate our country and reach our borders, we first need to deal with the Russian Empire, the Russian Federation, and only then, of course, carry out all the tasks of expelling the Russian army, or at the very least destroying it in Donbas. Russia can be dismantled, just as the Soviet Union was allowed to collapse, and the Union was even more powerful than Russia. It is also possible by putting pressure on the flow of Russia's oil and gas sector on so-called petrodollars to reduce it to zero. In other words, what we are seeing now are precisely the stages of destroying the Russian oil and gas industry, in which all our special services, which we have already mentioned, are involved. And for example, Prymorsk is one of the ports on the same level as the Novorossiysk port. Only the Novorossiysk port mainly pumps oil and oil products to Kazakhstan, and some Russian plants are involved in this as well. Tuapse, among others, also has its own port, which is located not far from Novorossiysk. But in the north, in the St. Petersburg area, there are 2 ports that ship petroleum products and gas condensate. These are Ust-Luga, which is south of St. Petersburg, and Prymorsk, which is north of St. Petersburg. Ust-Luga has already been targeted multiple times, again by Ukrainian security service drones. And now, once again, the SBU has also carried out an operation against Prymorsk. Well done, guys. They've taken on the northern sector. They have a sufficient number of drones, and most likely they have entire targeting systems, because without reconnaissance, pre-reconnaissance, adjustments, carrying out combat missions, and especially without confirmation, since you definitely need operational control tools to decrypt, to see where the strikes landed and how to improve future attacks, it wouldn't be possible. Security services simply can't operate without these mechanisms. And so what they started, by the way, they started this in parallel. They began with the oil transshipment facility. Directly, although before that, several oil pumping stations on the same BTS had already been hit. BTS-1, BTS-2. That's the Baltic Transport System, as it's called. This is a system of pipelines, oil pipelines and product pipelines, that pumps this oil and gas to the transshipment facilities, both of them. That's why it's a comprehensive approach. And you can clearly see a comprehensive, systematic approach to destroying this cluster, at least the northern cluster, by the Ukrainian security services. In other words, it's a kind of God service, I would say, that deals with these issues, adding to the overall problem of Russian oil transshipment.
Roman Grigorievich, I'd like to discuss with you the consequences of the drone attack on Poland and in what context. Right now, the European Union and NATO are trying to assess their overall response, whether it was successful or not, and there are different opinions on this. According to Polish data, out of 19 drones, at least 3 were shot down, which is about 16 to 17%. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, out of almost 500,000, over 400 are being shot down, so the efficiency rates and effectiveness indicators are completely different. And Mark Rutte, among others, says that it's impossible to scramble an F-35 for every such attack just to intercept decoys. After all, even with these shoot-downs, the amount of effort expended was so great that with such efforts it's simply impossible to talk seriously about conducting military operations. And how do you assess this? Was it panic that they scrambled several fighter jets just to shoot down Russian decoy drones? Or does NATO actually have the resources to take down such objects?
It's all just childish nonsense. The thing is, 24 so-called aerotels deliberately and intentionally entered the restricted airspace, the airspace of a sovereign country, and in fact, this should have triggered an appropriate response, at the very least a strike or attack on the places where they are produced, specifically on Yelabuga and Izhevsk. So what should have been done? What would you suggest in this case, Rutte? It was, in essence, simply a matter of giving the official order, or at the very least making the important decision to strike specifically and precisely those 2 particular factories that are responsible for producing and manufacturing these types of drones. NATO, as an alliance, has at least a couple dozen different ways and methods to reach the city of Yelabuga and successfully hit the aerotels located there. From the same Patriots to ballistic missiles, there are just an incredible number of options, and that's what should have been done. And as for scrambling the F-35s, that's like using a microscope to hammer in nails. Well, you can do it, of course you can, but it's just way too expensive to use a microscope as a hammer. In the same way, it's far too costly to use F-35s to destroy those same drones. So, in other words, the response is inadequate. At least for now, it's clearly inadequate. I mean, globally, there just isn't one. And if we get down to the specifics of this issue, then a certain type of frontal air defense should have been deployed along the borderlines from Belarus a long time ago. It was clear that since there were going to be some exercises ahead, provocations were inevitable. In other words, these provocations just started a bit earlier than expected. There are many questions like why was there coverage of the strike on Doha, on Qatar, on Israel, and coverage of Russia's strike on our settlement where 24 of our pensioners were killed? For some reason, this attack started earlier than it should have, purely as an information cover. Whether it was for one scenario or another, that's a different question. But the fact that they were supposed to carry out this kind of provocation was clear from their objectives. Basically, these exercises that are about to take place in Belarus, which will last for several days, were set up with this in mind. So it was possible to prepare, to deploy our resources, to request certain mechanisms. Moreover, it was already clear that there would be imitation provocations. From where? Last year, the year before last, helicopters entered the territory. They entered during exercises, during certain command and staff exercises. Just recently, a few days ago, Mi-8 entered Estonian territory. That was also a pure provocation. They watched NATO's reaction for 14 or 4 minutes. So this is all so-called testing. You just had to be ready for it. They asked our specialists how to organize frontal air defense to repel, let's say, this kind of thing. So there was no need to scramble the F-35s. In other words, they kind of overplayed it a bit here. In other words, they created a serious problem for themselves. They lost both missiles and a certain amount of aviation resources. That is, they spent way too much money when the same thing could have been done much more cheaply. Those 40,000 were being deployed along the Belarusian line. So this should have just been done earlier using those 40,000 troops. And that's enough to cover several hundred kilometers along the Polish-Belarusian border, specifically from air defense systems. So it's sufficient. They just needed to be trained. We're not against it. We've always offered. No problem. We'll teach them. Let's go. Let's do it now. At least now we'll teach them. I think that with this kind of provocation, the Russians would already be afraid to carry them out, especially with aviation strike assets if air defense systems are deployed, if they manage to deploy them along the front line. That's one option if we're talking about tactical, not global tactical decisions. Well, the second option would be to close off part of the airspace over Ukraine. We've been proposing that for 4 years now. Protect NATO countries, protect the airspace, even over our territory. we're suggesting take 100, 150, 200 kilometers for yourselves. For us, the optimal option would be for you to take the entire right bank. Take all of Western Ukraine under control, establish a certain no-fly zone there so that nothing flies over us at all. In other words, a no-fly zone, shoot down everything that moves in the air, no questions asked. Sort it out yourselves. We would have already moved to the center of Ukraine, to the left bank, and increased the density of our troops there. That is, by increasing the density of our air defense along the front line, I mean by increasing the density of the frontal air defense, we would have created an almost insurmountable barrier for Russian drones that could otherwise reach Poland. It's simply unrealistic. Next, we would have to talk with Belarus. That conversation would be much tougher. If something flies in from Belarus, we shoot it down over Belarus. If something flies again, we turn off the entire Belarusian economy like turning off the lights in a bathhouse. It's not hard to do, and we could even help in that case. In other words, we need to act a bit tougher with this Eastern horde. They don't understand any other way. Only a kick in the face will get through to them. There's no other way. It just doesn't reach their brains.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Roman Grigorievich, there's something else I'd like to ask you about. Today, military exercises began in Belarus called Zapad 2025. Today, footage was seen on Telegram channels showing Polish border guards first setting up barbed wire, then dragon's teeth appearing right on the border. All of this is happening in front of buses that were supposed to run from Belarus towards the European Union. How do you view these exercises currently taking place in Belarus? Let me remind our audience, 600 pieces of military equipment and 30,000 soldiers are participating in this event. What do you think of the West's reaction? And what we're seeing on the screens right now, would you say this is more of a political gesture or does it have some kind of military backing? Do people in the West really believe that, God forbid, some tanks could break through this border right now? Tell us your opinion about what you see.
Well, as I already said, it's child's play. For now, it's just child's play. If you really want to block off a certain direction, you need a full-fledged fortification. That is, they start with so-called minefield security belts, sometimes stretching for kilometers in depth. Then come the fortifications based on the location of elevations and lowlands, depending on the geographical obstacles. It's an entire process. But for now, it looks more like a show. As I said, like child's play, nothing more. If someone wants to break through, they will. It's just that there's nothing to break through with. But at this stage, what are 30,000? Well, that's not much. At most, 2 corps, and as for divisions, as many as you like. This is not a combat unit capable of carrying out tasks at the operational tactical level. In other words, it's not a combat unit in the pure sense. For exercises, yes, 5,000 Russians, 25,000 Belarusians. These 5,000 Russians will be telling the Belarusians how to properly pack the already torn apart soldiers into bags. Nothing more than that. They won't teach them anything else. But for provocations, yes, that possibility exists, especially for an informational campaign, as I already mentioned. That is what they can do as part of carrying out the objectives of these exercises. This includes carrying out some more informational provocations. Planes, helicopters, moreover, writing them off as so-called border incidents. This is a common international practice. A border incident while carrying out, say, those same tasks, especially if they mark out red zones not far from the borderline. They can, yes, of course. Naturally, no one will shoot them down there if they cross a certain distance or depth, and it will be classified specifically as such an action, as a border incident, nothing more. So for now, this could just be for show, but someone might want to spread information about the Polish army's readiness for something. Well, for now, it's all just for show. But for example, to block border crossings in a very competent way, to stop the flow of Chinese goods into Europe, and this is practically the so-called Second Silk Road, which goes from China through Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus into Europe. Now, that's a serious issue. And from this point of view, those would actually be the right actions. So it's more of a significant geopolitical informational stir to notably show China, for example, no, everything will stop right here before it reaches China. The main thing is just not to let it start up again so that they don't open up that flow again. Stop it and don't let it through. Obviously, those trucks aren't going to try to break through to the army anymore. They'll stand there for a month or two. Everything Chinese will just rot. All that Chinese junk will be brought back if anyone here even agrees to take it. That would actually be a pretty good move. And then in that case, such an informational stir would make sense. In other words, it should exist. You have to understand the objective. There is absolutely no military objective in this, or rather no military component.
Thank you, Roman Grigorievich. I'll just add, to continue your point, that Russian drones threatening NATO territory should be shot down right over Ukraine. Moreover, it's necessary to destroy Russian production facilities inside Russia itself. The head of the Bundestag Defense Committee made this statement literally just a few minutes ago. So someone does understand this after all. It would be good if the key players understood it too, wouldn't it?
That's just formulaic. Sorry, let me add. It's formulaic. War is mathematics. Anyone who understands military operations will, of course, break it all down into formulas. And by the way, you see, even the Europeans are starting to speak in unison with us now.
Thank you very much. Roman Zvetan, military expert, was live on Ukraine today. Goodbye.